Israel has declared war on Hamas, but is Hamas Palestine? That's an important question I haven't seen enough people ask themselves before posting their takes on social media. Now, the truth is, conflict between Israel and Palestine is certainly nothing new. It's been going on for decades or even millennia, depending on who you ask. But at the end of the day, anyone trying to present this conflict as anything other than deeply complex and nuanced is probably being intellectually dishonest. That is, unless they've been close enough to this conflict for its violence to have affected them firsthand. In that case, people like me acknowledging how nuanced it is can seem insensitive, like tacit support for your oppression at worst, or general disinterest at best. And I want to be clear that neither of those are my intent. If anything, my goal is to briefly, if possible, summarize the important distinctions between Hamas, the extremist group that launched this attack on Israel, and the Palestinian people at large. Because Palestine is not a monolith. And while Hamas's stated grievances do in many ways reflect those of the greater Palestinian people, there are huge differences in the ideology and methodologies embraced by different political groups within the Palestinian population. And it's important to understand that while Hamas is a very powerful political party within Palestine, it does not speak for all of Palestine, nor does it have all of their support. So let's talk about what Hamas is, how that pertains to the Palestinian people, and what any of this means for conflict with Israel. Hamas is an Islamist extremist organization that's recognized as a terrorist group by the United States and a number of European Union allies. Now, it's also one of two governing political parties of the Palestinian people, and one might argue the minority party. Today, Hamas rules over the Gaza Strip, which is a very narrow 6-mile wide, 25-mile long Palestinian enclave within Israeli territory. It's one of two Palestinian territories in Israel, with the other being the West Bank. Now, the Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated territories on the planet, with some 2.2 million Palestinians living within its borders. The other Palestinian territory, the West Bank, has another 2.7 million Palestinians living under the rule of a completely different political apparatus. There, you'll find the Palestinian Authority, which is the internationally recognized ruling government of Palestine, and its ruling party known as the Fatah. I apologize if I mispronounced that. Never said it out loud before. Now, Fatah is a far less secular political organization, meaning they don't place nearly as much emphasis on religious doctrine in their lawmaking. And Fatah was the governing party of both Palestinian enclaves until 2006 or so. Back in 2006, during regular elections for the Palestinian Legislative Council, Hamas candidates in the Gaza Strip secured about 44% of the popular vote, versus only about 41% out of Fatah. Now, for a short time thereafter, the two groups tried to find some sort of way to rule in conjunction with one another, but that soon devolved into open factioned conflict in what's now known as the Battle of Gaza. Now, this battle went on for 5 days with Palestinians versus Palestinians, until eventually Hamas pushed Fatah completely out of the Gaza Strip and secured control over the entire territory. Now, that means that Hamas really did secure about 44% of the popular vote within the Gaza Strip back in 2006. But as a result of the fighting that ensued from these two different Palestinian political parties trying to coexist, Hamas seized control of all of the Gaza Strip and has yet to relinquish it or even hold another election where they could potentially lose some share of their power. Now, to be clear, Hamas is not necessarily a deeply unpopular political faction among the Palestinian people in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In fact, about half of all Palestinians polled had at least something positive to say about Hamas. But the truth is that likely has less to do with Hamas and more to do with a collective Palestinian distaste for Israel. A study conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research as recently as June of this year found that around 60% of Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip under Hamas rule, feared speaking out against Hamas because of violent reprisals. And about 73% of those surveyed said that the governmental institutions Hamas operates are deeply corrupt. In other words, affinity for Hamas may have less to do with Hamas and more to do with Palestinians in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank agreeing that Israel is the real villain here. Now, I'm obviously not saying that Israel is the villain, but I am saying that it's important to understand that despite the significant ideological differences between Hamas and Fatah, the one thing they can agree on is that Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people have been repressive. Both of these groups believe the only real way forward is an independent Palestinian nation, but the important distinction comes in how they believe they can achieve those goals. Fatah believes they can get there through negotiation, whereas Hamas believes the only path is violence. Now, at this point, you may find yourself wondering if the Palestinian Authority and Fatah political party are the more reasonable group, why haven't they been outspoken in their opposition to these brutal attacks on civilians? And the answer is that we need to accept that this is a very complicated and nuanced situation for them as well. For Fatah officials to come out in opposition to this Hamas offensive would effectively amount to siding with Israel over Palestinian people in the eyes of many, and that not only runs counter to their own political ideology, but would effectively be political suicide. But it's equally important to understand that any kind of success for Hamas here is bad news for Fatah. Any sort of success will only strengthen and embolden Hamas and increase their grip on the Palestinian people, encouraging more to believe that violence is the way forward rather than diplomacy. And for Fatah, that also means diminishing power and authority within their own government. So to close, I would like to offer a little bit of subjective analysis here, because Hamas is a well-known and understood Islamist, extremist, and terrorist organization that's just as prone to use violence against its own people as it is against Israel to achieve its broader goals. It has deep strategic ties to Iran, and an emboldened and strengthened Hamas is not good news for the Middle East or even the Palestinian people. If you believe this attack was prompted or even warranted by the way Israel has had its boot on the neck of the Palestinian people, you need to understand that Hamas isn't just trying to remove that boot, they're looking to replace it with their own. As one final closing thought, I want to remind those of us on the outside looking in, who are far removed from this conflict, that there's no moral imperative to choose a side and start duking it out on social media or in the comments below videos like this, especially if you only have limited information at hand. Ultimately, it's okay to decry violence and brutality against civilians regardless of the group enacting it or the ideological reasons they provide. It's okay and even vital that we recognize and acknowledge brutality enacted by groups that we may empathize with, just as it's vital that we acknowledge the humanity in oppositional forces, not just to develop a better strategic outlook on the battlefield, but to look for ways to stop conflict from unfolding in the worst ways. I'm not here to defend Israeli policies that have oppressed the Palestinian people or Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians. I'm not here to pick sides in this conflict at all. I am here to remind you that real life is complicated, and not everything can be easily categorized as good guys and bad guys. Sometimes it's better to wait, watch, and learn than it is to be the loudest voice in the room. And that goes for me as well.